The station, called Virex 9, floated in deep space like a silent metal city, cold and proud, built by a species that believed they were the strongest minds in the galaxy. And inside its endless silver halls, humans were nothing more than tolerated workers, quiet shadows who fixed broken systems and cleaned what others did not want to touch. Because years ago, Earth had lost a brutal war against the Arcali Empire. And ever since that defeat, humans were labeled fragile, emotional, and inferior. And Daniel Reyes knew this very well, which was why he kept his head down every single day, speaking only when necessary, moving carefully, never making eye contact with officers who wore glowing armor that marked their rank and power. Yet even in silence, his mind never stopped observing, because humans survive by watching, learning, adapting. And on that particular cycle, he was assigned to repair a power conduit in Corridor 17, a restricted sector used by High Command, a place where humans were rarely allowed. And the air felt heavier there, charged with authority and danger. While his hands worked inside the open panel, his thoughts drifted back to Earth's blue skies and oceans he might never see again. And then he felt it, a presence behind him, not loud, not aggressive, just powerful, like gravity itself had shifted direction. And slowly he turned his head, and that was when he saw her. She stood tall with silver blue skin that reflected the corridor lights like polished metal. Her eyes glowing faint violet, calm yet sharp. Her uniform marked with the crest of a commander, one of the highest ranks in the Empire, and Daniel forgot to breathe for a second because she did not look like the monsters propaganda described. She looked beautiful, not in a simple human way, but in a way that felt ancient and strong and completely beyond his world. And he realized he was staring, openly, without lowering his eyes like he had been trained to do, and the silence stretched between them like a thin wire about to snap. Other officers nearby slowed their steps, sensing tension, because a human looking directly at a commander was considered disrespectful at best and suicidal at worst. And then she spoke, her voice smooth but edged with command. "Why are you staring?" And the corridor seemed to freeze around those words. Daniel knew this was the moment that could define the rest of his short life. He could apologize, look down, act weak as expected, or he could answer honestly, something humans did even when it was risky. And so instead of shrinking, he straightened slightly, meeting her glowing eyes with calm, steady courage. And he said, "Because you're stunning." And the words echoed softly in the metal hall, simple, direct, human, and every alien within, hearing distant, stiffened, waiting for the commander's reaction, expecting anger or punishment. But Commander Lyra Vale did not strike him. She did not raise her voice. She simply studied him as if he were something rare and confusing, her expression unreadable. And for the first time since the war ended, a human had spoken to her without fear, and something unfamiliar flickered in her gaze, curiosity, perhaps even respect, though she would never admit that so easily. And Daniel felt his heart pounding, but he did not look away, because humans had faced extinction more than once in their history and survived by holding their ground. And the silence grew heavy until finally she asked another question: "Are humans always so bold?" And Daniel answered carefully but firmly, "Only when something deserves honesty." And that answer made a quiet murmur pass through nearby officers, because honesty was not a trait the Arcali valued above power. Yet here stood a defeated species member speaking as if he had nothing to lose, and maybe that was exactly why it unsettled them. And Lyra stepped closer, close enough for him to see the fine patterns across her skin that shimmered like distant stars. And instead of punishment, she gave an order that shocked everyone present. "Report to my private chamber after your shift." And then she turned and walked away without another word, leaving confusion behind her like a trail of sparks. And Daniel exhaled slowly only after she disappeared around the corner, aware that private summons from a commander could mean interrogation, experiment, or worse. But deep inside, he also felt something else, a strange pull toward the unknown, because humans were explorers by nature, even in chains. And as he returned to his repair work, whispers filled the corridor about the foolish human who dared compliment Commander Vale. and whether he would still be alive by next cycle. And if you are enjoying this unfolding mystery and want to see what happens next between the human who refused to bow and the alien commander who did not punish him, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next part of this journey. Because what began as a simple question in a quiet corridor was about to change far more than either of them understood. And somewhere in the depths of Virex, 9 hidden systems recorded the interaction, flagging it as unusual, because even machines noticed when patterns broke. And tonight, inside her private chamber, Commander Lyra Vale would review that moment again and again, asking herself why a defeated human looked at her not with fear, but with admiration, and why that unsettled her more than any weapon ever had. And Daniel would walk toward her door, knowing he had crossed a line no human on that station had dared to cross before, and the empire that believed humans were weak was about to learn something it had never calculated. Courage does not require permission, and sometimes the most dangerous act in the galaxy is simply refusing to look away. Commander Lyra Vale was known across the Arcali Empire for one clear fact. She did not trust humans. She had fought in the final years of the war and had watched entire fleets burn because human commanders refused to surrender when logic demanded it. She had seen human soldiers fight long after defeat was certain, wasting lives for causes that seemed emotional and irrational. And in Arcali culture, emotion was considered weakness, something to be controlled, something that clouded judgment. So, when she returned to her private chamber and the door sealed behind her with a quiet metallic hiss, she expected to feel anger at the human's bold words in the corridor. Yet what she felt instead was curiosity, sharp and persistent, and that unsettled her more than any insult could have, because curiosity toward a lower species was not something a commander should entertain. She activated the chamber's surveillance feed and replayed the moment again, watching Daniel's posture, the steadiness in his eyes, the way he did not tremble. Most humans lowered their gaze instantly in front of her kind, trained by fear and years of humiliation. But he had not. He had spoken clearly, without arrogance, without mockery, simply stating what he believed, and that honesty lingered in her thoughts like an unanswered equation. A soft chime interrupted her analysis, the chamber doors opening to admit Daniel, escorted by 2 armed guards who looked ready to strike him down at the smallest sign of defiance. He stepped forward calmly once the guards withdrew, standing alone in the vast circular room where transparent walls revealed the endless stars beyond the station. Lyra observed him from an elevated platform, making sure the power difference was visible. You understand that humans are forbidden from direct compliments toward Arcali officers, she began, her voice controlled and cold. Daniel nodded slightly. Yes, Commander, he replied, simple and respectful. Then why risk punishment? She pressed, watching for hesitation, but he answered after only a brief pause. Because fear does not change truth. And again that steady tone unsettled her. She descended from the platform slowly, circling him as predators of her species often did when examining something uncertain. Your kind lost the war, she reminded him. You survive because we allow it. Daniel did not argue. He did not challenge her authority, but he said quietly, survival is not given. Commander, it is. Earned every day, and that answer held no rebellion. Only fact. Lyra stopped in front of him, searching his expression for sarcasm. Finding none, she activated a hollow display showing battle footage from the final assault on Earth. Cities in ruin, Arcali ships dominating the skies. You call this earning survival? She asked, and Daniel looked at the images without flinching. Yes, he said, because we are still here. The room grew silent, except for the low hum of the station's core systems. Lyra felt something unfamiliar stir again. Frustration mixed with reluctant interest. Humans were statistically weaker in physical strength, slower in reflex, and far less advanced in technology, yet they possessed a resilience that did not fit into Arcali calculations. You were not afraid in the corridor, she observed, and this time Daniel allowed a faint smile. I was afraid, he admitted, but I spoke anyway, and that distinction caught her attention sharply. Arcali warriors were trained to eliminate fear, to suppress it entirely, but humans acknowledged it and acted despite it, a different model of strength. And that difference began to form a dangerous question in her mind. What if human weakness was misunderstood strength? Before she could respond, an alert pulsed through the chamber, an encoded transmission from the outer colonies. Lyra turned to the display, and her expression hardened as data streamed across the screen. Several remote mining stations had gone silent. Within hours, no distress signals, no debris, simply erased from communication grids, unknown interference pattern. The system reported. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he stepped closer to the projection, careful not to appear intrusive. "Commander, that's signal distortion," he said cautiously. "It is not random." Lyra shot him a sharp look. "Explain," she ordered, and he pointed to repeating frequency dips in the holographic graph. "It is masked, but there is rhythm. Something is hiding." Its approach. The room felt colder as realization formed. The Empire had not detected an external threat in decades. They believed themselves unchallenged at this scale. Lyra studied the data again and saw what he meant, subtle but present. "You analyze military transmissions often?" she asked suspiciously. "No," Daniel answered honestly. "But humans learned pattern recognition from chaos. We had to." And for a moment Lyra imagined ancient Earth. Storms, wars, disasters shaping a species that survived through adaptation rather than dominance. Another alert sounded. This one more urgent. A patrol vessel near the affected sector had been destroyed, its final image showing a dark silhouette unlike any known ship design. Lyra felt the weight of command settle heavily on her shoulders. If this was a new enemy, the Empire was unprepared, and the High Council would not appreciate warnings based on human observation. Yet ignoring the pattern could mean catastrophe. She made a decision that surprised even herself. "You will assist me," she declared, turning fully toward Daniel. "This information does not leave this chamber. You will analyze further anomalies under my supervision." The words echoed with authority, but beneath them was something else. Trust, fragile and dangerous. Daniel nodded once, understanding the risk she was taking. Outside the chamber, rumors already spread that Commander Vale had summoned a human alone. Some officers whispered of manipulation, others of disgrace. And far above them in the command towers, certain political figures monitored Lyra's career closely, waiting for missteps. And now she was stepping onto unstable ground by involving a human in classified analysis. As Daniel began reviewing additional data streams, Lyra studied him not as an inferior species, but as a variable she could no longer ignore. She had believed humans were reckless and emotional. Yet here he stood offering structured insight without ego, and the deeper fear that formed in her mind was not about the unknown enemy in the outer colonies. It was about the possibility that everything the Empire believed about humans was incomplete, and incomplete knowledge in times of emerging threats could be fatal. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the station shifted into heightened alert mode. Red indicators flashing along the transparent walls while distant sirens hummed low and controlled, signaling that something vast and unseen was moving closer through the darkness of space. Lyra folded her hands behind her back, eyes fixed on the growing pattern in the data. And for the first time since the war ended, she did not see humans as the Empire's greatest past enemy. She began to suspect they might be its only unpredictable advantage. And somewhere beyond the stars, a fleet without a name adjusted its course toward the heart of Arcali territory, moving silently, calculating, unaware that inside one private chamber a commander who hated humans was beginning to question that hatred, and a human who refused to bow was about to become part of a decision that could reshape the balance of the entire galaxy. The decision was made within hours, quietly, and without informing the High Council. Because Commander Lyra Vale understood that if she waited for permission, the unknown threat beyond the border would already be inside their core systems. And so under the cover of a routine inspection mission, her warship, the Etherean Spear, detached from Virex 9 and slipped into deep space. Its engines glowing faint blue as it entered faster-than-light travel, and Daniel stood near the rear observation deck, watching the stars stretch into white lines, fully aware that no human had ever been invited onto an Arcali war vessel for strategic reasons before. The crew did not hide their discomfort. Whispers followed him through the corridors, some calling him a pet project, others calling him a liability, but Lyra ignored them. She had reviewed the data herself, and the pattern Daniel noticed was real. Something was advancing through the outer colonies with controlled precision, erasing stations without, leaving debris. And that kind of clean destruction suggested intelligence far beyond pirates or rogue factions. And as the ship exited FTL near the border sector, the first sign of something wrong became visible. An entire mining platform floated dark and silent, its lights extinguished, its hull intact yet lifeless, like a corpse with no visible wound. Lyra ordered a tactical scan, but sensors returned interference. The same rhythmic distortion Daniel had identified before, and this time it was stronger, deliberate, adaptive, as if the signal itself reacted to being scanned. "It is learning," Daniel said quietly from the analysis station, his voice calm but serious, and several officers turned toward him with visible irritation. Yet Lyra did not silence him. Instead, she asked, explain, and Daniel pointed to subtle frequency adjustments occurring milliseconds after each scan pulse. "It mirrors your detection method, then shifts just outside it," he said, "like it is studying you." And that statement sent a ripple of unease across the bridge, because the Arcali Empire had not faced an enemy capable of technological mimicry in centuries. Lyra ordered a boarding shuttle to investigate the dark platform directly, and against protocol she allowed Daniel to accompany the tactical team, not as a soldier, but as an observer. The shuttle docked against the silent station with a metallic thud, and as they entered the corridors inside, they found no bodies, no signs of struggle. Only abandoned tools and frozen holographic displays mid-operation, as if every living being had vanished in the same instant. The air felt thin, charged with something invisible. Daniel knelt beside a console and ran his fingers across its cracked interface. No heat signatures were detected during evacuation. He murmured, "They did not run." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Then what happened to them?" she asked. And before he could respond, the lights flickered violently, a low vibration humming through the walls like a distant heartbeat, and suddenly the tactical officer reported movement outside the station. Dark shapes emerging from the void, not ships in the traditional sense, but massive angular constructs that seemed to bend light around them, their surfaces shifting like liquid metal, and for a split second Daniel felt the weight of something ancient observing them. Not with emotion, but with calculation. The Etherean spear opened fire first, beams of concentrated plasma striking one of the constructs, but instead of exploding, it absorbed the energy, its surface rippling before releasing a pulse that disrupted Arcali's shields instantly. Alarms screamed through both the station and the warship, red light flooding every corridor. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos with precise command, ordering retreat to the shuttle. Yet as they ran, the station floor beneath them dissolved into shifting metallic patterns, pathways rearranging themselves, separating the team. Daniel was thrown against a wall as gravity inverted briefly, and through the distortion he saw one of the constructs extending a thin filament of dark energy into the station, scanning, analyzing, and he understood something terrifying. This enemy was not attacking blindly. It was studying biological and technological data before committing to full invasion. They were samples, test subjects in a galactic experiment. Lyra grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him forward as the corridor sealed behind them, cutting off two soldiers who vanished in a flash of silent light. No explosion, no scream, just absence. The shuttle barely escaped the station before it collapsed inward, compressed by the construct's field into nothingness. And back on the bridge of the Etherean spear, the crew fought desperately to stabilize systems, while the enemy constructs repositioned with impossible speed, predicting Arcali maneuvers seconds before they occurred. "They anticipate your strategy," Daniel shouted over the alarms. "Your battle formations are consistent. Your empire wins through dominance and repetition." Lyra met his gaze, understanding the implication. Their strength had become predictability. "Then what would humans do?" she demanded, and despite the fear pressing against his chest, Daniel answered without hesitation, "We would stop fighting the way they expect." And in that moment, she made a choice that would echo through history. She transferred partial tactical control to manual override. Abandoning standard Arcali formation protocols, the crew stared in disbelief as Lyra ordered irregular attack patterns, random thrust bursts, unpredictable firing intervals, chaos where there had once been discipline, and the constructs hesitated for the first time, their surface ripples slowing as they recalculated. One construct misaligned its energy pulse by a fraction of a second. An Arcali plasma finally breached its core, tearing through its metallic body in a violent burst of dark. Fragments, the bridge fell silent in shock because the Empire had not adapted like that in centuries. Yet victory was incomplete. 3 constructs remained, adjusting rapidly to the new unpredictability. And as they began surrounding the Etherean spear, Daniel realized this was only reconnaissance for a far greater force, a probe measuring response efficiency before full-scale deployment. Lyra ordered emergency FTL jump despite unstable coordinates, risking spatial fracture rather than total annihilation. The engines roared, space folded violently, and the warship vanished just as another construct fired, leaving the border sector once again silent. Except now, it carried proof of an enemy that did not fear the Arcali Empire and did not underestimate humanity. And as the Etherean spear reappeared deep within Imperial territory, with damaged shields and shaken crew, Lyra looked at Daniel not as a curiosity, but as an unpredictable asset, because the mission beyond the border had revealed 2 truths: something vast and intelligent was coming. And the only reason they survived first contact was because a human suggested breaking the rules, and far beyond scanning range, the remaining constructs transmitted their findings into the darkness, marking the Arcali core worlds for future engagement, updating threat assessment to include an unexpected variable, human adaptive interference detected, probability of resistance increased, further study required, and the real invasion had not even begun. By the time the Etherean spear returned to controlled space, the damage reports were still being processed, and the crew had not yet recovered from the shock of surviving an enemy that seemed to think faster than their own battle systems. And yet for Daniel, the greater realization was not the enemy's strength, but its pattern, because during the chaotic retreat, he had noticed something small but important. The constructs did not act randomly. They reacted to prediction models they analyzed, behavior, and then optimized their counteraction, which meant they depended on order and calculation, and that understanding lingered in his mind like a key waiting for the right lock. While Commander Lyra Vale stood alone in the strategic chamber reviewing the combat footage repeatedly, watching the exact moment when abandoning traditional Arcali formations disrupted the construct precision, and she felt a truth forming that unsettled her deeply. Her empire had grown powerful by perfecting order, but perfection created predictability, and predictability could be studied, mirrored, and broken. When she summoned Daniel again, it was not as a suspect, but as a consultant, though she did not use that word openly. The chamber lights dimmed as holographic projections filled the air between them, showing simulations of possible invasion routes, projected fleet sizes, casualty estimates that climbed into catastrophic numbers if the constructs deployed in full force. If they return with larger numbers, Lyra said calmly, "Our defense grid will fall within 3 cycles." Daniel studied the projections without panic, his brow slightly furrowed, and he asked something no Arcali officer had asked yet. What if we stopped defending? And the room fell quiet because an Arcali doctrine defense was sacred. Fortified lines, structured resistance, layered shields, all designed for frontal confrontation. Lyra crossed her arms. "Clarify," she demanded, and Daniel pointed to the holographic maps. "They expect resistance here and here," he said, marking primary fleet routes, "so do not give it to them. Fragment your forces, hide some, sacrifice visible targets intentionally, make your pattern impossible to predict." Lyra considered the suggestion carefully. It sounded reckless, even dangerous. Yet during the border encounter, unpredictability had been the only effective weapon. "Humans fight like storms," Daniel continued quietly. "Messy, hard to model, painful to contain." And that statement resonated with her, because Arcali warfare was precise and symmetrical, beautiful in structure, but vulnerable to imitation. And now a different model of combat was emerging before her, one based on confusion rather than control. Before she could respond, an emergency signal pierced through the chamber. Another outer colony had vanished, this time closer to core territory. And unlike before, there were partial recordings, brief flashes of dark constructs deploying thin energy filaments that entered biological organisms without visible damage. And then the organisms simply collapsed, not dead but emptied, neural activity erased, data harvested. Daniel felt a chill despite himself. They're not only destroying, he whispered, they're studying consciousness. And Lyra's eyes narrowed as she realized the deeper threat. If the constructs were learning how biological minds functioned, they could eventually simulate strategy beyond pattern recognition. They could anticipate creativity itself. And that possibility shifted the stakes from territorial defense to existential survival. Within hours, the High Council demanded a full briefing, and Lyra stood before them projecting the border footage in her analysis. Yet, as expected, several senior officials dismissed the threat, calling it isolated anomalies exaggerated by frontline stress. One even questioned her judgment for incorporating human input into tactical decisions. And Daniel, observing silently at the back of the chamber, saw the same flaw humans had suffered from before their own wars, pride that blinded leadership to emerging danger. Lyra, however, did not retreat from her position. She presented casualty projections and pattern disruptions clearly, her voice unwavering. And when one counselor suggested removing the human from strategic proximity, she responded sharply. The human's deviation from standard protocol preserved this vessel and its crew, and that public defense marked a subtle but significant shift. Because for the first time, an Arcali commander openly acknowledged human contribution before the highest authority. The council reluctantly granted limited reconnaissance authority, not full mobilization, but enough for Lyra to act. And as she exited the chamber, Daniel walked beside her through the long metallic corridor, aware that resistance within the Empire might become as dangerous as the external enemy. "You risk your career by trusting me," he said quietly, and she answered without looking at him. "I risk extinction by ignoring you." And that blunt truth defined the fragile alliance forming. Between them, days later, new sensor arrays were deployed across the border regions using irregular scanning intervals based on human randomization algorithms, and almost immediately faint anomalies appeared, shadow movements beyond detection range that previously blended into predictable scans. The constructs had adjusted to Arcali patterns but struggled with chaotic input. And this confirmation strengthened Daniel's hypothesis. Yet it also confirmed something more terrifying. The constructs adapted rapidly, their distortions shifting in response to the new, irregular scans within hours rather than days, meaning their learning curve was accelerating. And in a private moment, Daniel confessed his deeper fear to Lyra. "They're not only studying your empire, they're studying me." Because during the last encounter, one construct had focused its scan directly on him longer than any other biological subject. And Lyra considered that possibility seriously. If the constructs identified humans as adaptive variables, they might prioritize eliminating or analyzing them first, turning humanity from a dismissed species into a primary target. And that realization carried a heavy weight, because Earth was not prepared for an invasion of such scale. And as the Empire debated mobilization and political factions argued over resource allocation, the constructs continued their silent advance, always just beyond direct detection, like predators circling a civilization too confident in its walls. And inside the strategic chamber, Lyra and Daniel worked through simulations late into each cycle, combining Arcali precision with human unpredictability, developing hybrid strategies never before attempted. And with every passing hour, Lyra's understanding deepened. Humans were not superior in strength or technology, but their minds were shaped by survival through uncertainty, and that made them dangerous in ways her empire had never valued. Yet danger could also be protection if directed properly. And as distant colonies flickered off the map one by one, the Empire stood unknowingly at the edge of a transformation. because to survive what was coming they would need more than power. They would need the chaos of the human mind. And somewhere in the vast darkness beyond their borders, the constructs adjusted their calculations again, updating threat models to include cross-species strategic fusion, probability of resistance increasing beyond initial forecasts, and the next encounter would not be a test, it would be a trial, and this time the human mind would not only observe the storm, it would become it. The first strike against the core worlds did not come from the constructs. It came from within the Empire itself, because fear spreads faster through politics than through space, and as reports of vanished colonies increased, factions inside the High Council began searching for someone to blame before they searched for solutions, and Commander Lyra Vale, once praised for her flawless service record, suddenly became a convenient target. Whispers turned into formal accusations, claiming she exaggerated the threat to justify experimental tactics, and that her reliance on a human advisor compromised Arcali purity and command structure. And while enemy constructs advanced silently through border systems, the Empire's leaders argued in polished chambers about reputation and tradition, and Daniel felt the tension growing each time he walked through the station corridors. Officers who once ignored him now stared openly with suspicion, some with hatred, because accepting his insight meant admitting their own limits, and pride was deeply rooted in Arcali culture, stronger even than logic at times. The situation escalated when a classified defense simulation, incorporating Daniel's chaotic strategy models, was leaked to conservative council members who viewed it as reckless and destabilizing. And within a single cycle, an official order was issued. Daniel Reyes was to be detained for unauthorized interference in military protocols, pending investigation for espionage. The charge was absurd yet powerful, because once labeled a spy, a human had no voice. And when security officers arrived at Lyra's command deck to escort Daniel away, she did not stop them immediately, not because she doubted him, but because she understood that open defiance without preparation would destroy any chance of influencing the council later. Daniel did not resist as energy restraints locked around his wrists. He simply met her eyes with calm understanding, a silent message passing between them. This was not the true battle. And as he was taken to a containment wing deep inside the station, the Empire's official narrative shifted quickly. Reports minimized the external threat and emphasized internal instability, claiming that reliance on human unpredictability created strategic vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, beyond Imperial space, the constructs continued harvesting colonies with increasing efficiency, their learning algorithms accelerating with each engagement, and Lyra stood before the council once more, this time not as a confident commander presenting evidence, but as an accused officer defending her judgment. The chamber was colder than before, counselors' expressions rigid and distant. You allowed emotional bias to influence command decisions, one declared. You elevated a lesser species into advisory proximity, another added sharply, and Lyra listened without interruption until they finished. Then she projected the most recent border footage, showing 3 Arcali fleets destroyed within minutes using traditional formation tactics. This is not emotional bias, she said evenly. It is adaptation failure. Her words echoed through the chamber with controlled force, but the council remained divided. Some feared the external enemy. Others feared the precedent of human influence more, and as debate escalated, an urgent transmission cut through their argument. A major defense outpost, only 2 jumps from the core, had fallen, not destroyed but disabled, its systems overridden and repurposed as a beacon transmitting unknown coordinates in a deep space. And the realization hit the chamber like a shockwave. The constructs were no longer testing borders. They were mapping invasion corridors directly into the Empire's heart. Yet even in that moment, one counselor suggested focusing on internal stability first, arguing that dissent within command could fracture defense lines faster than the enemy. And Lyra understood then that hesitation might cost billions of lives, so she made a decision that would permanently mark her record. Without requesting permission, she accessed the detention wing remotely and authorized Daniel's release under her direct command authority. The chamber erupted in protest as she spoke clearly. If we continue debating pride while our systems fall, There will be no empire left to defend. And before the council could override her access, Daniel was already being escorted back toward the command deck, his restraints deactivated. And when he entered the chamber, he did not speak immediately, aware that every counselor viewed him as both threat and necessity. Lyra turned toward him publicly and asked the question that would define the moment. Can we stop them? The simplicity of the question cut through politics, and Daniel answered just as simply, not by fighting the way you always have. Silence followed, heavy and uncertain, and outside the station warning sirens began to sound as long-range sensors detected multiple construct signatures emerging simultaneously from different vectors, not one fleet, but many, approaching in coordinated patterns that suggested full-scale invasion had begun. The council no longer had the luxury of debate. Emergency mobilization orders were issued. Fleets scrambled into formation. Yet Daniel saw the fatal flaw immediately. They were defaulting back to structured defense grids, predictable layers the constructs had already studied, and he stepped forward. Despite the tension in the room, projecting a new strategy across the central holo display, splitting fleets into smaller autonomous cells, abandoning centralized command nodes, using decoy transmissions and deliberate false retreats to overload enemy prediction algorithms. Some counselors protested the risk, but Lyra spoke over them, her voice sharp with final authority. This human warned us before and preserved my vessel when her doctrines failed. We either evolve now or we collapse. And in that moment, several counselors who had doubted her saw the incoming threat data updating in real time. Construct formations adjusting perfectly to their current fleet alignments, and fear replaced pride at last. Authorization codes were entered hesitantly, granting Lyra temporary wartime autonomy to execute the hybrid strategy. But even as orders transmitted outward, another betrayal unfolded quietly. A senior defense minister, fearing loss of influence, secretly transmitted a backup command to maintain traditional formations in half the fleets, unwilling to abandon established doctrine entirely. And that hidden contradiction would soon create chaos on the battlefield, as Arcali ships launched into the void, facing an enemy that learned from every pattern and punished hesitation without mercy. And Daniel realized that the true danger was not only the constructs advancing through space. It was the Empire's struggle to let go of its past, because sometimes the greatest betrayal is not sabotage, but the refusal to change when survival demands it. And as the first clashes ignited near the core systems, the fate of billions balanced not only on weapons and shields, but on whether an empire proud enough to conquer humanity could humble itself enough to learn from it. The invasion did not begin with a roar. It began with silence, a deep, unnatural silence that spread across 3 star systems as communication relays flickered out one by one. And then the construct fleet appeared, not from one direction, but from everywhere at once, emerging like fractures in space itself, their dark metallic bodies folding out of distorted light. And for the first time in recorded Arcali history, the core defense grid activated at full capacity, thousands of warships aligning in radiant formation around the capital world, shields overlapping in precise geometric layers, beautiful and deadly. Yet Daniel stood on the central command deck beside Commander Lyra Vale and felt dread instead of confidence, because the enemy had already seen this shape in simulations, and as the first exchange of fire erupted, the constructs responded exactly as predicted, their energy pulses cutting through outer shield layers in calculated intervals, dismantling the formation piece by piece as if peeling apart a machine they had already disassembled before. And in distant sectors where certain fleets obeyed Lyra's hybrid orders, the battle looked different, chaotic, unpredictable bursts of thrust, ships scattering instead of holding lines, transmitting false retreat signals, and then striking from unexpected angles. And there, for the first time, construct targeting systems hesitated, their responses misaligned by microseconds that became openings, but in sectors where the secret minister's counterorders preserved traditional formations, destruction was swift and merciless, entire squadrons collapsing in synchronized explosions that lit space like falling stars, and the contrast became impossible to ignore. They're prioritizing predictable clusters, Daniel reported, watching real-time casualty data scroll upward, and Lyra did not waste breath on anger toward the Council's betrayal. She issued immediate override commands, forcing remaining fleets to fragment and disengage from rigid patterns. But confusion had already spread through command channels, some captains uncertain which doctrine to follow, and in war uncertainty kills faster than weapons. As the construct advanced toward the capital planet itself, their surfaces shimmered with adaptive algorithms, recalibrating to each new maneuver. And Daniel realized something terrifying. The enemy was not only learning tactics. It was learning psychology, predicting hesitation, modeling reaction time. Based on command hierarchy delays, exploiting the Arcali need for centralized authority. Cut the central node, he said suddenly, his voice urgent. Shut down unified command. Make every fleet autonomous. Several officers gasped because that meant surrendering centuries of disciplined structure. But Lyra understood instantly. The constructs tracked decision flow through signal hubs. By severing the hub, they would erase the predictive pathway, and without waiting for council approval, she disabled the capital's primary command beacon, plunging the battlefield into controlled disorder. Captains forced to rely on instinct and local data rather than synchronized directives, and in that disorder, something remarkable happened. Arcali ships began fighting differently, improvising, forming temporary alliances mid-battle, using debris as cover, mimicking the chaotic storm logic Daniel had described. And construct targeting efficiency dropped sharply, their pulses striking empty space more frequently as predictive models failed to stabilize. Yet the cost was heavy, because improvisation required courage and risk, and many ships were lost before captains adapted to independent decision-making. On the ground, panic spread as citizens watched orbital firestorms streak across the sky. But Lyra remained steady, issuing only minimal guidance, trusting that unpredictability was now their greatest shield. And then one of the largest construct vessels descended toward the capital, dwarfing anything seen before, its surface rippling with accumulated data from every encounter. Clearly the command core of the invasion fleet, and Daniel felt its focus like pressure against his mind because during earlier scans it had studied him longer than others, and now its energy filaments extended not toward the fleet, but toward the planet's communication arrays. Attempting to re-establish predictive mapping through civilian networks, it is trying to restore pattern control, Daniel said, realizing that if the enemy regained centralized flow, the battle would tilt back instantly. And Lyra made the hardest choice of her command. She ordered a strike directly against the construct core vessel, not with structured assault, but with a swarm of smaller craft instructed to act without coordination. Dozens of pilots launching in uneven waves, some accelerating at random intervals, others powering down mid-flight to vanish from sensor grids before reigniting engines from unexpected angles. The battlefield became chaos incarnate, a storm of light and debris where no clear front existed, and inside the massive construct vessel its surface flickered erratically, struggling to compute thousands of non-linear trajectories. And in that instability, Daniel saw the opening. Target the nodes that glow brighter when we move unpredictably, he shouted, recognizing energy spikes where recalculation strain peaked. Lyra relayed the adjustment instantly, and concentrated fire struck those vulnerable nodes repeatedly, cracks forming along the construct's dark hull as its adaptive algorithms overloaded, and for a moment time seemed suspended as the colossal vessel shuddered, emitting a deep resonant vibration that echoed through space like a dying signal, before collapsing inward in a violent implosion that rippled outward in shock waves of distorted light. Smaller constructs faltered immediately, their coordination disrupted without the core command link, and Arcali forces, now fully embracing decentralized chaos, pressed the advantage relentlessly, driving the remaining enemy units back beyond core orbit. And as the last construct signatures retreated into warped space, silence returned once more. But this time it was the silence of survival rather than impending doom. The capital world still scarred but intact, fleets battered, yet standing. And on the command deck, Lyra exhaled slowly for the first time in hours, turning toward Daniel, not with formality, but with something deeper, acknowledgement, because without the human mind's refusal to conform to perfect order, the empire would have fallen in a single calculated sweep. And across the empire, reports began to circulate not only of victory, but of how that victory was achieved, not by dominance alone, but by adaptation. And though the war was not yet over, the balance of perception had shifted permanently. Humans were no longer a conquered footnote in imperial history. They had become the variable that broke the machine, and somewhere in distant space, the retreating constructs transmitted new data into the darkness, marking humanity not as inferior, but as a strategic anomaly requiring elimination or alliance. And the galaxy itself seemed to pause, aware that something fundamental had changed, because empires rise through power, but they survive through evolution. And on that battlefield, evolution had worn a human face. The aftermath of the battle did not bring celebration. It brought reflection, because victory had come at a cost that could not be measured only in destroyed ships or shattered stations. Entire sectors were scarred, thousands of lives lost, and the illusion of invincibility that once surrounded the Arcali Empire had been permanently broken. Yet in that fracture, something new began to form, something neither pride nor tradition could erase. And as reconstruction fleets moved through damaged orbits and emergency teams stabilized failing colonies, a different kind of meeting took place inside the High Council chamber, one not fueled by accusation but by necessity. Commander Lyra Vale stood once again before the assembled leaders, but this time no one questioned her judgment. The data projected behind her showed the clear truth. Sectors that adopted decentralized hybrid tactics survived at a rate nearly 3 times higher than those that resisted change, and the statistical contrast silenced even the most conservative voices. Daniel stood at the edge of the chamber as he had before, still technically an outsider, yet no longer invisible. And when a senior counselor finally spoke, the tone was no longer hostile. The human contribution altered the outcome of this conflict. The words carried weight because they were spoken publicly, recorded into imperial archives. And Lyra did not soften her response. The human contribution ensured our survival, she corrected calmly. And for the first time, the chamber did not erupt in protest. Instead, several counselors inclined their heads slightly, an Arcali gesture of acknowledgement rarely given outside their own species. And though political tensions still lingered, the direction of the empire had shifted irreversibly. In the cycles that followed, new joint strategy divisions were formed, not as symbolic gestures, but as functional necessity. Arcali precision merged with human unpredictability in formal doctrine revisions. Training programs altered to encourage adaptive thinking rather than rigid command chains. And on distant Earth, news of the battle reached human settlements with disbelief and quiet pride, because for the first time since the war, humanity was not spoken of as conquered, but as critical. And yet beneath this growing respect, an undercurrent of uncertainty remained, because the constructs had retreated, not surrendered. And their final transmissions indicated recalibration rather than defeat. Lyra understood this deeply, which is why when she invited Daniel to stand beside her on the observation balcony overlooking the capital world, she did not speak of triumph. The planet below shimmered with repair grids and orbital platforms rebuilding shattered defense arrays, stars reflecting off metallic towers that had nearly fallen. "You changed us," she said quietly, not as a commander, but as an equal. And Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "You chose to change, and that distinction mattered because adaptation is never forced. It is accepted." Lyra studied him for a long moment before asking the question that had lingered since the beginning. "When you looked at me in the corridor and spoke without fear, did you know it would lead here?" And Daniel allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. "I only knew that fear should not decide every action," he answered, simple and honest as always. And Lyra felt something settle inside her, a realization that strength was not defined by dominance alone, but by the courage to respect what once seemed lesser. In the weeks that followed, Daniel was offered a formal advisory position within the Empire, the first human to hold strategic rank. And while some traditionalists resisted quietly, the The memory of the invasion remained too fresh to ignore. Joint exploration initiatives were proposed, not merely for expansion, but for preparedness. Because if one adaptive intelligence existed beyond their borders, there could be others, and cooperation between species was no longer a philosophical debate, but a survival strategy. Yet as fleets prepared for extended patrols, Daniel continued studying residual construct signals, faint distortions at the edge of deep space. And one evening he detected something subtle, a pattern not of retreat, but of observation. The constructs were still watching, measuring how the Empire had evolved after contact. And when he shared this with Lyra, she did not react with alarm, only with steady resolve. "Then let them observe," she said. "They will see that we learn faster than they calculate." And that quiet confidence reflected the transformation that had taken place, not just in military structure, but in cultural perception. Humans were no longer tolerated workers in distant corridors. They were partners in shaping the Empire's future, and on Earth. Recruitment programs began for volunteers willing to serve in joint fleets, explorers who understood that the next conflict might require even greater unpredictability. As the first mixed species task force launched beyond the original border zone, carrying both Arcali warships and human-engineered adaptive modules, a sense of cautious hope replaced old resentment. Because history had pivoted on a simple moment of honesty, and the galaxy itself seemed to acknowledge the shift. Where once there was rigid hierarchy, there was now collaboration. Where once there was dismissal, there was respect, and far beyond known space, the constructs adjusted their projections once more, updating threat classification not to Empire alone, but to hybrid civilization, adaptive capacity exceeding predictive threshold, and for the first time in their cold calculations, an uncertainty value expanded beyond safe parameters. Because they had encountered something machines struggle to quantify: courage shaped by emotion, intelligence shaped by chaos. And as Lyra and Daniel watched their fleets disappear into the stars together, neither conqueror nor captive but allies, they understood that the true victory was not destroying a single enemy vessel. It was breaking the belief that strength belongs to one species